Here at Evolution Craft Brewing Company, we pride ourselves in making a very quality product. And that starts with 4 main ingredients. First and foremost would be a quality water source. We're very fortunate to have a well on the property because this property used to be an old ice production facility. They needed extremely large quantity of quality water to produce their ice, and the city was not able to supply that to them. So they dug their own well, which we are able to now use for our beer production. That water comes into our building. It is not filtered. It is not treated. There's no additives. It's not stripped. It's pristine, as close to perfect brewing water as you will find. The second ingredient that we need for our beer making is barley, malted barley, in fact. We source that from the Canadian area, get a quality malted barley that comes into our building, and we'll need to mill that. Milling is really the first process in beer making. We will run the barley through our mill, and the idea here is to simply cut the husks off without crushing the barley kernel. We want water to be able to get inside, but we don't want to produce flour. After the barley is milled, we'll then send it through an auger conveyor system that's going to move it to the batch hopper. Batch hopper is really a silo that sits on top of a scale. We're able to then weigh the exact needed amount to equal what the recipe requires for that particular brew. We're going to mill that through the mill, the same process as we did the bulk grain that was coming from outside, until we have the recipe all in one spot. From that point, we're going to move it into the collection of tanks that we call the brew house. The first vessel is going to be the mash mixer. When we decide to get started with the brew process, we're going to move our milled malted barley to that, and we're going to add hot water at that point. We're going to stir it up, making something similar to an oatmeal that we call a mash. And that process is going to allow that water to get into those barley kernels. It's going to pull out color, flavor, sugar, and some starches, and then we're going to take that entire mixture and we're going to move it into the fourth vessel in our brew house setup, which is the lauter tun. The lauter tun is a tank that has a false bottom in the bottom of it. The entire slurry or mash gets moved in there as a whole, liquid and solids combined. And then we're going to allow the liquid to run through the bottom, and we'll take that liquid and pump it back on top. And we'll do this repetitively until we've built up a grain bed in the bottom of the lauter tun that creates a natural filter that's going to filter out husks or any milling solids from the barley. We then take that sugar-rich, flavor-rich liquid that at this point we're going to call the liquor, and we're going to move it to the last vessel called the kettle. Once it's into the kettle, we're going to do some very simple things. One, we're going to bring it to a boil. We'll then add hops. They're sourced out of the Pacific Northwest for more American style hops. And we also get a large influence of hops from European hop producers as well. The hops we add at the very beginning of the boil are really going to contribute to those bittering characteristics that you want in larger IPAs. The hops we add in the middle are going to give us some earthy, grassy tones. And hops that we add at the very end of the boil are really give us some flavor and a lot of aromatics. At the end of that boil process, we're going to send the entire wort mixture through a whirlpool process, and that product is then going to pull together any hop particulates or any solids that made it from the lauter tun to the center. We're able to discard them and we'll move that to our fermenters after passing through a heat exchanger to cool that down. We'll want the temperature to be between 68 and 70 degrees as it's transferring into our fermenters, at which point we're going to add some yeast. After the yeast have been added, fermentation will start almost instantly. Byproduct of fermentation is going to be CO2 and alcohol. The alcohol gets stuck in suspension in the liquid, and CO2 is going to vent out of the top, and you might see that sometimes with some of our buckets on the floor, creating basically a natural airlock. Primary fermentation is going to take between 5 and 10 days, and at the end of that period, we're going to let the yeast sort of start to condition the product. And if there's more yeast than we can use, it'll then get moved into a tote where we give that, as well as the spent grain from the brew process, to a local farmer on a dairy farm who feeds it to his livestock. Eventually, we hope to get some of that dairy product back, whether it be in milk form or beef form, to use in the public house restaurant, therefore kind of completing the circle. After about 10 days of fermentation and then another 4 to 5 days of conditioning. This product, at this point we call it beer. It's not carbonated, it's flat. We're gonna move it into one of our pan bottom tanks. Those are called our bright tanks. We'll send them through a very high-tech centrifuge that's going to pull out any of the solids that are in that liquid and give us a very consistent, uniform product that we're then able to package to send to market. Once it's in the bright tank, we need to carbonate it. We carbonate through forced carbonation using a carbonation stone. At this point, we've got two options for packaging. First, we can do draft. If it's a draft product, we hook up some lines from the bottom of the tank and we run them directly to clean and sanitize kegs, and we will fill those kegs directly through the top tap. If it's going into package a 12-ounce bottle, the best way to follow this is actually follow the bottles. You'll see that first they come in to a machine called a depalletizer. It's doing just that. It's depalletizing. Every skid of glass you're looking at has 2,250 brown bottles. We prefer to use glass. We think it's a little sexier. We like the way it looks, and we appreciate that it doesn't contribute any additional flavor characteristics to the end product. It's a very important part of the actual packaging of the beer into a bottle is a 3-head filler. First thing that's going to happen is every bottle is going to get flipped upside down, sprayed with a sanitizing solution, and allowed to gravity dry. Then it's put back onto the line and moves to the center section of this machine. The center section of the machine is the actual filler segment. The filler segment is going to suck out any oxygen that may be in there. It's then going to fill that bottle with beer, and then it'll come off, go through another small section before eventually being crowned. You'll notice there's a small amount of foam that is above the top of the bottles. We want that foam to push out any residual oxygen that potentially could have been in that bottle. We'll then pass through a little shower. The little shower is just to sanitize the outside of the bottle before it goes into the labeler. It'll pass through a little drying device that's going to blow off any extra liquid or moisture that's on the outside of the bottle before actually entering the labeler itself. The labeler is going to apply one label to the body section of each bottle, and then it's going to feed it into our drop packer. The drop packer drops the bottles into a box. If you look down the conveyor line, it's almost like a horse track. There's 4 lanes. Each of the bottles are put into those 4 lanes. And when there's 4 lanes wide by 6 bottles deep, there's a conveyor that will lift up the box. The bottom basically drops out. The bottles drop into that box. The box then falls back to the conveyor height. And now we've got a full box of 24 12-ounce bottles full of beer with labels and crowns. The last step on the packaging line is for them to pass through a case sealer before one of our employees removes it from the outgoing conveyor and begins the palletization process. From that point, we're going to move the product into our cold storage room. This whole process, we can do about 250 to 270 cases every hour. That ends up being somewhere around about 30 kegs that which you would relate to in the market.